Every time you stream a song today, every time an artist releases music independently, every time a musician owns their master recordings, you're witnessing the result of a war that most people don't even know happened. Before 1993, the music industry operated on a simple principle. Labels owned everything, artists owned nothing. Then Prince discovered something in his contract that everyone else had missed. The strategy he developed was so brilliant, so unprecedented, that Warner Brothers executives initially thought he was bluffing. Change his legal name to a symbol. Make it impossible for the label to market him. Create music under the contract, but ensure it had no commercial value to them. Record hundreds of songs and lock them in a vault they couldn't access. It was genius. It was insane. And according to Sheila E., who watched the whole thing unfold from the inside, it was the most courageous thing she'd ever seen an artist do. Because Prince knew that winning this battle meant losing everything first. If you want to discover more untold stories about music legends, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This is a story that changed the industry forever, and it started in the most unlikely way. In 1978, a 19-year-old musician from Minneapolis walked into Warner Brothers Records with a demo tape and a dream that seemed impossible. He wanted complete creative control. He wanted to play every instrument on his albums. He wanted to produce everything himself. The executives listened politely, exchanged glances that said this kid had no idea how the business worked. And then they did something surprising. They said yes. Not because they believed in his vision, but because talent that raw only comes around once in a generation, and they knew they could shape the business terms later. Once he understood how things really operated in the music industry. The contract they offered looked generous on the surface. A 3-album deal with options for more. Higher royalty rates than most new artists received. Creative freedom in the studio, which was almost unheard of for a debut artist. Prince read through the pages of legal language, saw the opportunities laid out before him, and signed his name at the bottom. Over the next 15 years, Prince became one of the most successful artists in Warner Brothers history. Purple Rain sold over 25 million copies worldwide. The soundtrack dominated the charts for 24 consecutive weeks. He won an Academy Award, multiple Grammys, and became a cultural icon whose influence extended far beyond music into fashion, film, and the very definition of artistic expression. Prince had always been prolific. While other artists struggled to produce one album every 2 or 3 years, he was recording constantly, sometimes finishing multiple songs in a single day. By the late 1980s, he had accumulated hundreds of completed tracks locked away in the vault at Paisley Park, his private studio complex in Minnesota. These weren't rough demos or half-finished ideas. They were fully produced, album-ready songs that he believed were some of his best work. And Warner Brothers wouldn't let him release them. The label had a carefully calculated strategy for maximizing profit from their biggest stars. Release too much music too quickly, and you saturate the market. Space out the releases, build anticipation, and each album becomes a major event that generates maximum revenue. From a business perspective, their approach made perfect sense. From an artist's perspective, especially an artist as creatively driven as Prince, it felt like suffocation. The tension finally erupted in April 1993 during a meeting at Warner Brothers headquarters in Burbank. Prince had come prepared with proposals, release schedules, and explanations for why his unreleased material deserved to reach his fans. The executives listened with the patient expressions of people who had heard similar pitches from countless artists over the years. When he finished, they explained once again that the market couldn't support the release schedule he wanted. When Sheila E. arrived at Paisley Park 3 days later, she found him in a state she had never seen before. Not angry, not defeated, but focused with an intensity that was almost frightening. He had made a decision. and he needed her to understand why he was about to do something that everyone would think was crazy. The strategy, he explained to her, was unlike anything that had been attempted in the music industry before. First, he would change his legal name. Not to another word, but to an unpronounceable symbol, a combination of the male and female gender symbols that had no phonetic equivalent in any language. Warner Brothers owned the name Prince under the contract, but they didn't own a symbol that couldn't be spoken or written. The label wouldn't be able to market him properly. Radio stations wouldn't know how to announce him. Fans would be confused. And that confusion would make his Warner Brothers albums less valuable to the label while he fulfilled the remaining album obligations in his contract. Second, he would continue recording music under the contract, but he would deliberately make it uncommercial, experimental, difficult to market. He would give Warner Brothers exactly what the contract required, but nothing that would generate the sales numbers they expected. And third, he would start appearing in public with the word slave written on his face, making it impossible for anyone in the media to interview him without addressing the issue of artist rights and record label control. Sheila E. listened to this plan and understood immediately what it meant. He was essentially committing professional suicide in the short term, gambling that he could survive long enough for the contract to expire and rebuild his career on his own terms. No major radio stations would play his music if they couldn't figure out what to call him. MTV wouldn't know how to promote videos from an artist with no pronounceable name. His album sales would plummet. His cultural relevance would seem to evaporate overnight. And he knew all of this. He had calculated the costs down to the last detail, and he had decided it was worth it. Not just for himself, but for every artist who would come after him. Everyone who would face the same choice between creative freedom and commercial success. On June 7, 1993, Prince Rogers Nelson ceased to exist. In his place appeared an artist known only as a symbol, a visual representation that the media struggled to reproduce and eventually started referring to as the artist formerly known as Prince. The announcement sent shockwaves through the music industry, and the media coverage was exactly what Prince had anticipated. A mixture of confusion, mockery, and gradually questions about why an artist at the peak of his career would make such a bizarre decision. The first album released under the symbol came out in September 1993, and it was deliberately challenging. The music was experimental, the themes were confrontational, and the overall package seemed designed to confuse rather than attract casual listeners. He was systematically devaluing himself as a commercial product while maintaining his integrity as an artist. And it was working. And through it all, he maintained absolute silence about the specifics of his strategy, letting the media speculate while he continued recording, performing, and waiting for his contract to expire. Sheila E. remained one of his closest confidants during this period, and years later, she would describe watching him navigate those years as one of the most difficult experiences of her life. She saw the toll it took on him emotionally, watching his cultural relevance seemingly vanish while he stuck to a plan that most people couldn't understand. But she also saw something else. She saw other artists starting to pay attention. She saw younger musicians asking questions about contracts and ownership that previous generations had never thought to ask. She saw the conversation in the industry beginning to shift, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, but definitely shifting toward issues of artist rights and creative control. Warner Brothers, for their part, found themselves in an impossible situation. They had one of the most talented artists in music history under contract, but they couldn't effectively market him. They owned the rights to his master recordings, but those recordings weren't generating the revenue they had projected. And every public appearance where he showed up with "slave" written on his face generated negative publicity that reflected poorly on the label. They tried negotiating. They tried accommodating some of his requests for more creative freedom. But Prince had moved past negotiation. He was playing a longer game, and he wasn't willing to compromise until the contract expired completely. While fulfilling his Warner Brothers obligations with deliberately uncommercial releases, Prince was simultaneously building something revolutionary at Paisley Park. The Vault, a climate-controlled storage facility in the basement of his studio complex, was filling up with material that represented his true artistic vision during this period. He was recording constantly, sometimes working 20-hour days, creating music that he had no immediate plans to release. The Vault became legendary in music circles. Session musicians who worked at Paisley Park during this period would later describe the experience of recording multiple albums worth of material that they knew might not be heard for years, possibly decades. Prince would finish a complete album in a week, listen to it once, decide it wasn't the right time for its release, and lock it away. Then, he would immediately start working on something completely different, driven by a creative productivity that seemed superhuman. Engineers calculated that during the peak of his Warner Brothers battle, between 1993 and 1996, he was producing enough music for approximately 3 full albums per year, and almost none of it was being released publicly. By early 1996, Warner Brothers had reached a conclusion that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. Their contract with one of the most successful artists in music history had become a liability rather than an asset. The Symbol albums weren't generating significant revenue. The negative publicity around artist rights was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. And industry observers were starting to question why a major label would maintain such a contentious relationship with a legendary musician. In March '96, Warner Brothers and Prince reached an agreement. He would deliver one final album to fulfill his contractual obligations, and then he would be released from the contract 2 years earlier than originally scheduled. In exchange, Warner Brothers would retain ownership of all master recordings created during their partnership, which represented most of his greatest commercial successes. For Prince, this was the victory he had been working toward for 3 years. He was free. He could release music on his own schedule, through his own label, with complete creative control. The cost had been enormous. His mainstream popularity had declined significantly. His commercial viability as a stadium touring artist had diminished. The final Warner Brothers album was released in November 1996 under the title Chaos and Disorder. The title was deliberately provocative, a final statement about his relationship with the label. And then, for the first time in 18 years, Prince was completely independent. But the real earthquake in the music industry came 6 months later, in May 1997, during an interview that hardly anyone noticed at the time. Prince, still using the Symbol as his name, was discussing his future plans when a journalist asked him about the specific legal strategy that had enabled him to exit his Warner Brothers contract early. And for the first time publicly, Prince explained the loophole he had discovered, the legal mechanism that had made his entire battle possible. Under United States copyright law, there was a provision that allowed artists to reclaim ownership of their master recordings 35 years after the original creation date. This meant that even though Warner Brothers owned his masters now, in 2013, he would legally be able to reclaim Purple Rain. In 2014, he could reclaim Around the World in a Day. In 2015, he could reclaim Parade. The ownership that the label considered permanent was actually temporary, and most artists had no idea this legal option existed. The implications were staggering. Prince hadn't just won his own freedom. He had revealed a pathway that every artist could potentially use to reclaim their work. The 35-year provision had been in copyright law since 1978. But almost no musicians understood it or had attempted to use it. Record labels certainly weren't advertising its existence. But now, Thanks to Prince making it public, artists who had signed contracts decades earlier suddenly realized that they might be able to reclaim ownership of their most valuable work. The music industry's entire business model, which depended on labels maintaining permanent ownership of master recordings, was potentially vulnerable in ways that no one had fully recognized. Warner Brothers executives, when they learned that Prince had publicly revealed this information, understood immediately that they had been outmaneuvered on a level they hadn't anticipated. The battle had never been just about his contract. It had been about changing the system itself. And he had succeeded. Within months, other major artists started filing notices to reclaim their masters under the 35-year provision. Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Bryan Adams, and dozens of others began the legal process of regaining ownership of their earliest work. The labels fought back with lawsuits arguing various technicalities about how the law should be interpreted. But the door had been opened, and it couldn't be closed again. Sheila E., watching this unfold, realized something that she hadn't fully understood during those difficult years. Prince hadn't just been fighting for himself. He had been willing to sacrifice his peak earning years, his mainstream popularity, and his commercial viability to expose a truth that would benefit thousands of artists he would never meet. The slave written on his face hadn't been a publicity stunt or an emotional breakdown. It had been a calculated message designed to keep attention focused on artist rights until he was free to reveal the legal mechanism that could actually change the system. And it had worked. Prince spent the next 20 years operating as an independent artist, releasing music through his own NPG records, experimenting with internet distribution before streaming services existed, and demonstrating that a major artist could succeed outside the traditional label system. And more importantly, he had proven that independence was possible, that an artist could own their work, control their creative direction, and still reach an audience. When Prince died in April 2016, the tributes focused primarily on his musical genius, his incredible performances, and his cultural impact. But within the music industry itself, another conversation was happening. Artists, managers, and lawyers were acknowledging that the modern landscape of artist rights, from streaming royalty negotiations to independent distribution platforms, existed in large part because Prince had been willing to fight the battle that everyone else thought was unwinnable. Taylor Swift's public battles to own her masters, Kanye West's campaigns for artist ownership, and countless independent musicians building careers outside major labels were all walking paths that Prince had carved out through years of personal sacrifice and strategic brilliance. Sheila E. spoke at a memorial service weeks after his death, and she said something that captured the full scope of what he had accomplished. She said that watching him fight Warner Brothers had taught her that true artistic freedom wasn't something that could be given by a corporation or granted by a contract. It was something that had to be claimed, defended, and sometimes fought for at great personal cost. And she said that every artist who owns their work today, everyone who releases music independently, everyone who negotiates from a position of understanding their legal rights, owes a debt to a man who was willing to make himself a symbol so that others could remain themselves. The war that Prince fought between 1993 and 1996 changed the music industry in ways that are still unfolding. The 35-year reclamation provision he revealed has returned billions of dollars worth of master recordings to their original creators. The precedent he set for independent success has enabled entirely new models of artistic distribution and fan engagement. And the questions he forced the industry to confront about ownership, control, and the value of creative work continue to shape negotiations between artists and labels today. Every streaming royalty paid directly to an artist. Every independent release that reaches millions of fans without label support. Every contract negotiated with an understanding of artist rights. These are the outcomes of a battle that most people watched with confusion, that many dismissed as the self-destructive behavior of a difficult artist, but that ultimately proved to be one of the most important fights in modern music history. Prince didn't just change his own circumstances. He changed the circumstances for everyone who would come after him. And he did it by being willing to lose everything in order to win something much bigger than himself.